Dar Chapter 18, Bone, Antler, and Ivory. When Dar woke up the next morning, Selim was already at work. Impressed by the old man's energy, Dar got up quickly to join him. Selim stopped what he was doing to greet him. Dar, why don't you start by carving something your grandmother could use to make her life easier? Does she have any ivory or bone needles? No, just wooden ones, Dar answered. I've grown up listening to her outbursts when they break in her hand while she's at work on a piece of skin. Selim smiled. That sounds like the sister I remember. Here's a piece of ivory left over from my bracelet. Sit beside me and throw this hide over your lap for protection. Dar took the hide and sat down. I don't know how to begin. I've never worked on ivory before. You'll learn. Ivory is good to start with. It's not as brittle as bone or antler, and it takes a polish well. He picked up his flint chisel and scratched an outline of a small needle on the ivory. You're going to take the chisel, follow my scratch marks, and cut deep, angled grooves that meet below the surface of the ivory. Go slowly until you have a feel for what you're doing. Dar worked cautiously, trying to trace Selim's marks exactly. He cut deeper into the material with each chisel stroke. Finally, Selim said, Do you think your needle has been separated from the rest of the ivory? Worried, Dar made several more careful strokes in the grooves. Now, watch, Selim said, taking Dar's piece from him. When Selim pressed hard on the wide end of the needle, the entire needle popped up from the ivory. You did a good job, Dar. The needle wouldn't have come out if your grooves hadn't been deep and accurate. Dar grinned. What about the eye of the needle? In good time. Thin down the wide end of the needle with this sandstone. When you think it's thin enough, take this little flint awl and bore a hole in it. Be careful, it's a delicate job. Dar rubbed the wide end of the needle with the sandstone until he thought it thin enough to start drilling the eye. Working first on one side and then the other, he quickly bored a clean hole just where he wanted it. He held the needle up for Selim's approval. Fine so far, but you're not quite finished, Selim said. Use this scraper to make the needle smooth and round. And when you've done that, rub it back and forth on the sandstone to sharpen the point and polish it. The needle gradually changed as Dar worked on it, becoming round and smooth and sharp at the tip. He looked up and smiled. Now I know how to make a needle. You've learned far more than that. You'll use almost the same method for whatever you want to make. What would you like to do now? I'd like to make a spear point out of antler like Toreg's, Dar said. I know that Bowen, the boy I was initiated with, will want one. That's a generous idea, Dar. He must be a close friend. Dar was embarrassed. He had been misunderstood. I didn't mean I was going to make one for him, just that he'll be envious of mine. Selim said nothing. We've never been close, Dar said. Selim shook his head. It must have been lonely, growing up without the friendship of the only boy in your clan your own age. Why isn't he your friend? Selim asked. He's always looking down on me, Dar answered. Bone is bigger than I am and usually braver. Well, you're changing. It took courage to come here. Are you sure the height of a person really matters in a friendship? Dar sat still, thinking about Selim's question. Selim stretched to pick up an antler lying in a nearby pot of water. I keep some antler soaking to soften it. Dar, get started on your spear point. Scratch its shape on the surface of this antler. Then cut grooves into the scratch marks deep enough to reach the soft center. When you're sure you've gone deep enough, gently pry out your spear point. Dar still worked slowly, but with more confidence. When he pried the spear point from the antler, it wasn't as smooth as he would have liked, but it was in one piece. Selim looked up and nodded his encouragement. You've told me what bothers you about Bowen. Is there anything about him you like?" Dar answered quickly and easily. "He's full of energy and he knows a lot. I don't like it, but he's better at flint work than I am." "He doesn't sound like a bad person. Are you sure he looks down on you?" "Maybe. The problem has been that you've looked up to him, and, as you said, you haven't liked that." Dar could feel his face flush. He turned to pick up the flint scraper and began to smooth down the spear point. He was grateful to have work to do as he thought about Bowen and what Selim was telling him. Dar remembered when Bowen had refused to enter the sacred cave first, showing his fear to Dar for the first time. Dar had been surprised at his own reaction to this. Instead of satisfaction, Dar had felt only sympathy for Bowen, and this feeling had lasted throughout the initiation ceremony. Dar sharpened his weapon. Selim was right. It had been lonely growing up without a close friend. When he finished the spear point, he held it up. "I'm going to give this to Bowen and start making antler points for all the hunters when I get home." Selim looked up and smiled, then returned to etching an elaborate design on the creamy surface of the bracelet. "Grandmother will love your gift," Dar said, and was swept by a wave of affection for both Mora and Selim. "I can't wait to tell her about you, your life here, your carving. There's nothing like this bracelet in our clan." "Maybe someday there will be other such pieces," Selim said. "Dar, why do you want to be a carver?" Dar had never asked himself why he wanted to carve and had to think before answering. "I used to have the job of lighting the morning fire. I carved little animals on scraps of wood before the others were up. It was my favorite time of day. It was quiet. I felt free and in charge. And even if my work wasn't very good, the ideas and decisions were mine." "I know those feelings well," Selim said. "But it sounds like the carving stopped when the morning fire was no longer your job." "Yes, I thought I'd have to give up carving after my initiation when I became a man, a hunter. And when I saw Torig's spear thrower, I thought I could never make anything like that." Dar smiled at Selim. "You've made me change my mind." "I'm glad I have, Dar. I like making tools and weapons, but it's been more important to me to try to capture the spirit of an animal in my carving." He shrugged. "Of course, I don't always succeed." Dar's voice rose. "But the leaping horse looks so alive." "In a lifetime of carving, Dar, there have been both failures and successes. But it's been a good life." Dar nodded almost to himself. "A good life."